Our next speaker is going to be Paul Asadoorian, and he's going to talk about embedded systems and his plot to take over the world. Excellent indeed. Alright, so meanwhile, while Paul is setting up, I was wondering, how did you like Brucon so far? Any reactions? Alright, thank you. Wow, what a great audience. Anyone knows a good joke, meanwhile? Maybe the classic joke? No one? Alright. Alright, you ready?
I need help with something though.
Alright.
So like while I'm getting set up, I need you to take a video of the audience.
Alright.
Okay, but I need you. We need to help me out. So today's my wife's birthday. So and I'm here and she's in the U.S. and every Thursday night I devote to Paul.com. So she's not very happy about all that right now. She's actually fine with it because I left presents in the house. But I thought it would be nice if I could take a video of everyone saying "Happy Birthday, Mrs. Paul.com." How's that sound? Can everyone help me out with that? On 3, 1, 2, 3.
Happy birthday, Miss Paul.
Oh, you guys are awesome. Thank you. Okay. That just scored major brownie points, or not. Yeah, 300 beers.
All right, please again give Paul a warm round of applause.
Is it up on the screen yet? No. How about now?
Yeah.
How does that look? Excellent. So thank you very much. I want to thank the Brucon folks for having me out here to do training and give my presentation on my plot to take over the world. And really what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to tell you how to take over the world, but I thought about how serious the embedded system security problem is and has been in my entire career. I've always had this affinity towards embedded systems. I don't know, they always seem to be so much more vulnerable than everything else. Everyone seemed to overlook them. So I thought I'd put a presentation together in the context of, let's look at embedded system vulnerabilities and how you could use them to take over the world. If I can use embedded systems vulnerabilities to take over the world, there must be something really bad, and maybe we need to think about changing some things. So I'm not going to present, we'll talk about some vulnerabilities, we'll talk about scanning the internet, we'll talk about what you need to take over the world, but the most important thing I want you to take away from this presentation is what we can do to change things. I've set up a website where we can continue this discussion and bring to the public light a lot of embedded systems vulnerabilities. So we'll talk about that at the end. In the meantime, I have a couple slides about who I am. How many people listen to Paul.com? I'd just like to personally thank you. I don't know why you listen, but thank you for listening. So I've got this little slide montage that I put together to tell you about who I am because, I thought that was kind of the best way. So this is the podcast. We like to do the podcast. We like to drink beer, and of course, we like to drink Belgian beer. We like to hack naked. People have sent us all kinds of pictures of them in their hack naked gear, and you can see people skiing in the Alps and Dan Kaminsky kissing the hack naked sticker. So, like I said, with the beer, it's a very integral part of our show. So we thank Belgians for making the fine beer that we drink on the show. We also enjoy destroying computers. Now, if you've never tried this, it's extremely liberating. It's so much fun. All those years of frustration that you've had dealing with computers, you can let it all out. Now, we've had to get creative, right? I mean, anyone can take a sledgehammer and go smash a computer together, and that's fun. Don't get me wrong. Don't let me stop you from taking the old-fashioned hammer and going smashing a computer. However, we started to get a little more creative. We've used things like thermite, potato cannons, sledgehammers, and most recently we played what we called Geek Pinata, where we hoisted laptops up on the tree and we took swings at them. That was great fun. So who knows what will come next? These are the members of Paul.com. I just want to thank those guys. A lot of them, we all support each other in the research and the presentations that we do. So that, their feedback was very valuable for this presentation. My day job, I work for Nessus. I'm the product evangelist. I don't actually have to wear like a robe or anything or have a book and preach. Well, I guess preaching, you could call it that. One of the funny things, I don't get too much stuck on this, but one of the things I did find recently is that we had an iPhone app come out for Nessus. We are working on an Android app as well. And while I was on vacation, I was searching for Nessus, and I found Jesus. So now I've fulfilled my role as a product evangelist, which is actually my title at Tenable Network Security. So, taking over the world. Many have tried, maybe many have tried in the movies, and I tend to watch too many movies. But I got started thinking about what would I need to take over the world. And I started talking about this with my wife one day, and I said, just in the interest of conversation, what would you need to take over the world? And she kind of looks at me like, what have you been drinking or smoking? And I said, no, I'm doing this presentation. And she just kind of rolled her eyes like, oh no, here we go. So I said, geeks like requirements and specifications. Okay, well, maybe we have to deal with requirements and specifications. But let's really put it down into 3 things that you would need to take over the world. In a general sense, okay? So at some point, someone now usually screams out like women and things like that. Like that all comes after. I'm talking about 3 general things that you need to take over the world. Anyone care to take a guess? Beer. See, that falls in the category of things that come after your world domination plot has succeeded. Control, so let's say power is how I termed it, yeah. The other things are money. Right? You need money. You need to be able to bribe people. You need to be able to influence people. You need to pay people off and buy things like armies and things like that. So you need money, okay? The next thing you need is power. And when I thought about power, the way I described it was the ability to use those resources to influence and control people. And to me, that was social engineering, which is why I gave the icon credit to Chris Nickerson. So, I don't know if Chris is around, but you're in my presentation in a positive light, Chris. Imagine that. So, stealth. That was the 3rd component that I really had to think hard about. And I said, okay, so I have all this money and power, but if people know I want to take over the world, the first thing everyone's going to do is stop me from doing that, because why should Paul rule the world? Why shouldn't someone else rule the world? Why should there be one ruler of the world? People are going to try and foil my plot, if you could believe that. So the other thing you need is stealth, because if everyone knows about your plan for world domination, it's doomed from the beginning, right? When James Bond finds out that someone's about to take over the world, he sneaks around, he does his spy thing with his little handgun, and he foils their plot. So those are the 3 things that you need. Now, let's look at how to use vulnerabilities in embedded systems to accomplish our 3 goals to take over the world: money, power, and stealth. So, using embedded systems to make money. The first is video games. I think this is largely an untapped area of research. Now, we did see a presentation, which I have a reference to later in the presentation, about hacking Wii systems. Certainly, the Xbox 360 is a platform that could very well be hacked. Now, there's a lot of people hacking on these platforms, but they're not doing it with world domination in mind. They're doing it because they want to run games that they copied from their friends, which is fine. I fully support that. I hear that, that's how a lot of us got our start hacking, is hacking so that we could play video games. But these are all network connected, and now, especially with things like the Xbox 360, where you're going online and there's a whole e-commerce aspect to it. So I don't know if it is as popular in Europe, but in talking with people, it didn't seem to be. But in the U.S., we've got all these devices coming out now that let you get access to things like online Netflix movies, Roku players that give you access to Amazon.com to be able to stream movies, All of these are connected to the internet, connected to your TV, but there's some type of transaction taking place. I can, from my living room, go on my little Roku player here, which I'll tell you about some interesting things I found with the Roku. I can go on my Roku, and I can rent a movie right from my remote control, and my credit card gets charged. So there's some kind of commerce happening through these video games and entertainment systems. Wireless routers, I mean, that's something I've talked about for a long time, and people are like, well, you're still presenting about, embedded in vulnerabilities. I'm like, yeah, because no one's doing anything about them, and there's still tons and tons of ridiculously easily to exploit vulnerabilities on wireless routers that all route your traffic when you're on the internet. If you're using the wireless here, you're using an embedded system to gain access to the internet. If I control that embedded system, I can use it to make money. Printers and faxes. I got some awesome stuff that, well, we all know Bob, right? Yeah, Bob found it when he was scanning the internet. So how can we use them to gain power? Well, of course, information equals power. And if I can gain control of embedded systems in strategic locations, I can collect a lot of information. I can collect financial information. I can collect information about people. And the ability to manipulate that information is powerful. If I can change information as it's passing through these embedded systems, that's a very, very powerful thing. Also very powerful, to kind of go back to the wireless router example, is I can control lots of people at once. If I control that one little access point on the wall, all of your traffic is going through it. That means I can snoop on and potentially manipulate multiple people's traffic by modifying one single device. Now, I guess if I'm really good, I can break into everyone's laptop, but I'm the lazy hacker who wants to take over the world, so I'm going to go after the access point. Previous presenters have touched on this. We talk about gaining power, and not necessarily breaking into a power system to melt it down, but maybe I break into it and threaten to melt it down and extort money, and that gives me money, which also gives me power. Okay, so there's a lot of people doing research. Josh Wright, Travis Goodspeed, who both were actually just on the Paul.com podcast. And InGuardians has a great article on metering attacks and advanced metering attacks. So there's a lot of great research. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about SCADA systems and things like that. If you want to talk about that stuff after, I'm more than happy to. But I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, other than to mention we can use it to gain power. And power in a literal sense as well. So now, stealth. I like the fact if I'm stealthily going to take over the world, that no one pays attention to these embedded systems. And the best way I can describe this is if you go into anyone's home who has high-speed or DSL access, and you ask them, hey, do you have a router? And they're like, what's that? And you go, well, it's that little bluish purple thing and black thing, maybe collecting dust somewhere. They're like, oh, yeah, I have one of those. I think it's fell behind the desk, and I just kind of left it there because I was afraid to touch it. So if you break into these systems, there's definitely not a user interactive piece to it. There's no mouse and keyboard on it. So I can break into it and do whatever I want. No one's going to stroll up and log in and go, hey, how come there's this error message on my thing, or why is that machine blue screening? There's nothing like that. So it's very, very stealthy. The other thing in terms of stealth is that no one pays attention to the security, and a lot of that is done on purpose. When you go into the store to purchase an embedded systems or a router, let's say, I own a small business, or I'm someone who's just going to, got DSL, and someone told me I needed this little router firewall thing. I go into the store. Which one am I going to purchase? The cheapest one, right? I don't care about its features. I don't care about the name. I definitely don't care about security. I just want the cheapest one. The vendors know that. It's not a secret, right? Everybody knows someone's going to go pick the cheapest one. So how do we make the cheapest one? We leave out security. We squish everything down. We put multiple functionality on one chip so that implementing security is really, really hard. ASLR on something like a router is virtually unheard of. Now, it's on some systems, but certainly not the home one that you're going to pick up in the store. It's not there. These advanced features don't exist on embedded systems, largely because the manufacturers are out to make the cheapest device possible. Now, that's good for us in our plot to take over the world, because it means they're going to be more vulnerable. The other problem with embedded systems is that I think there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there, and it's ripe for their picking because not all of us have the equipment to play around with. the best, embedded vulnerabilities and good stuff I've done with embedded systems has been around stuff that I had access to. Now, that's not to say I can't get it. So, control systems, people often think, well, I get this control systems and nobody's going to hack it because no one really knows about it. I mean, I can pretend to be anyone and call them up and obtain that particular hardware. That's not the problem. Of course, you can send me free stuff and I'll look at the security of it. No one's taken me up on that offer yet. I don't know why. So the other thing I wanted to prove, now that we've gone through power, money, and stealth, is that these embedded systems and embedded computers are everywhere. And the best place I thought to look was a place called wiggle.net. Has anyone heard of wiggle.net? Yeah, it's a global thing, which I think is awesome. And people go around and they essentially war drive, except now you can do that with your Android phone. There's an app. Your Android phone goes around, you just put it in your pocket, and you're war driving or walking, and you're picking up all the open wireless access points, and you're uploading your data to wiggle.net. That's awesome. So wiggle.net produces some statistics. So statistically, if I wanted to take over the world and target a particular embedded systems made by a manufacturer, because they've listed out the manufacturers, even just by SSID, I know that there's approximately 1.9 million Linksys routers out there that are open wireless routers that are ripe for the picking. So now I can strategically target by vendor and know which vendors, roughly, are the ones that I want to target. Not only that, but the fact that there are millions of these things out there proves to me that it's everywhere. If you don't believe me, I'll show you a map. Okay, that's Boston. That's fine. That's like the other side of the pond. That's Brussels. All of the red and green mean, these are all open wireless access points. The green means it has good signal and good bandwidth, and the red means it has okay bandwidth. So apparently you guys have okay bandwidth over here. But you've got a lot of open wireless access points, which proves my theory of that these things are everywhere. Now I have to prove that they're vulnerable, that people can break into these embedded systems and do evil things with them. So there was some previous research. I'm not the first person to go forth and do this research, so I've done a little bit of homework and found that researchers scanned the internet before Bob and found 21,000 vulnerable routers, and their administrative interfaces were viewable from anywhere in the world, and they failed to change the manufacturer's default password. Well, there's problem number one with the manufacturers and the industry in general. Why is there a concept of a default password? And you'll see how we can use this to gain potentially money, power, and do it stealthily. So the researchers provided the ISPs. So these, a lot of the manufacturers that were found to be vulnerable were actually ISPs. And the ISPs hand you a device. The device has an Ethernet. It has some kind of coax connection. So it's a wireless access point. It's everything all in one. So it's your cable DSL router, your Linksys router, and they merged them together. And many ISPs give these devices to their subscribers, and they try to manage them themselves. So the ISPs were given the findings of the research from Columbia University that found 21,000 vulnerable systems, and said that they should do something to protect their customers. Do you think this is true? No. So I was reading another article that said, well, in the case of Time Warner, this is a story where someone found that if you disable JavaScript and browse to the router, that you can just log into the router and be an administrator. And you'll see a lot of these things putting the default username and password inside of the web page that you log into. So the person who found this extremely easy to exploit vulnerability that grants you administrative access to the routers of Time Warner cable subscribers, Time Warner said, well, we can't really do anything about it. If you read a little further in the article, it says Time Warner has not just the model that was vulnerable, but that's just a small portion of the 14 million devices that we have out there. And oh, by the way, chances are if you find a vulnerability in them, they can't do anything about it. Now, for world domination, that's awesome. For the rest of the world, that sucks. So I started talking with Bob and thought, well, there's 14 million devices out there just from Time Warner alone. What if Bob started doing some scanning of the internet to look for these devices? And maybe Bob used Google or Shodan to find the most popular ISPs and start targeting some of these ISPs and seeing which model routers they're running. Maybe I use Aaron to discover their full IP address ranges dedicated to those ISPs and scan just those blocks with Nmap on port 80 to find the web administrative interfaces on these routers and manually poke through the results and see what I find. Or Bob is even more evil, automate something to find vulnerabilities, exploit them, and upload custom configurations or firmware. That's the more evil attack that I'm really concerned about. So Bob and I did this research, and we're here telling you about it to make the world a better place. I don't think everyone has the same goals. If you scan the internet, you'll find that. I totally agree. It's totally wrong. And there are a lot of ISPs that do block it, but when you start looking globally around the world, you find that they're open. And that's part of my plea to these ISPs is to block port 80. So it's an excellent point. Correct, yeah. Or disable the administrative interface for the ISPs that run their own or manage their own embedded systems. Absolutely. No, it's a good point. And that's where I hope we get to, right? It's an easy thing. Why we're doing it, I don't know. I think it's an education thing. So, and that's part of what, at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about a site where, I want to help build essentially a community that's saying, hey, let's put a little more security. And it's not like we're asking them to educate users or do something hard. We're asking them to do things like turn off a web interface. So I went out and found some vulnerabilities with Bob's help, and found some tons of fail on the internet with respect to wireless routers, printers, and I did a little bit with the Roku. So here's where Shodan comes handy. Let's say I've done some research into a Huawei router, and I have a vulnerability for a Huawei router. And I want to find an ISP that's running the Huawei router and exposing it to the world via the web administrative interface. I do a search for that on Shodan. I see that Colombia is a pretty popular country to run this particular kind of router. Likely, the ISP in Colombia will run this kind of router and maybe leave it, it has left it open because Shodan found it. I take this IP address, I figure out which ISP is running this particular brand of router, and that's the one that I scan. So how do I scan it? You can scan it with Nmap. This is actually a pretty well-tuned version of Nmap command, rather. I'm using version light. I'm saying only show me the open ports, and I'm doing some other Nmap goodness, and I can scan, roughly 2 million IP addresses in about 37.5 hours time. These are some old statistics. If you built up some Amazon EC2 systems, you could probably do this quicker. So we're looking at about 40 hours for every 2.5 million IP addresses or 2 million IP addresses. That was kind of slow. I'm an impatient hacker. So I said, well, how can I do this quicker? So I came up with some other alternate methods. NTP can be used to identify devices. HD Moore, there was a great post on Kernel Ownage that talked about the NTP vulnerabilities and how every NTP server logs the clients that log into it. We'll show you how to use that to find some embedded systems. DNS zone transfers from certain places can give you listings of embedded systems, and I'll show you how that's done. Something I won't go into too much, it's covered in this blog post by GNU Citizen, is you can brute force subdomains. Specifically, a lot of these embedded systems, like wireless routers, will have dynamic DNS providers just for their particular model. So our linksys.com is an example of a dynamic DNS provider. They will give you a DNS name tied to an IP address. When your IP address changes, it'll update the record for you. You can go on that domain and try and do DNS subdomain brute forcing. So it's just like password brute forcing, except you're brute forcing DNS with a list of potential host names. So let's talk about NTP. At one time, way back when, Netgear shipped a router with a hard-coded NTP server. So the NTP server that the Netgear products use was hard-coded. To go to the computer science department of the Wisconsin University, after this router started shipping, there was a massive denial of service at the University of Wisconsin, coincidentally, because all these routers started contacting their NTP server. There's a whole article about it that you can go read about how they dealt with the traffic and see all kinds of statistics and pretty graphs and stuff. Now, routers still point to it. And how do we know that? Well, because thanks to HD Moore, we can show that. So what you do is, I did some research and found the NTP server that all the Netgear routers were listening to. I used Metasploit and HD Moore's techniques to tell me all of the clients that are probing that NTP server. A lot of them were in DSL and cable modem providers across the world. And I can tell that basically by their domain names gives me kind of a signature that they're DSL providers. What do you want to make a bet that those are Netgear routers that haven't updated their firmware? Because the way they fixed this NTP thing was, Netgear said, well, we'll just ship new firmware. But not everyone applied the firmware update, so you query the original NTP server, you get a nice listing of systems that not only are likely to be embedded devices, but they're likely to be vulnerable embedded devices that haven't updated their firmware. So that's a little quicker. The other way, this is the quickest way to enumerate embedded systems on the internet, is just to do a good old-fashioned DNS zone transfer. And you're like, well, who still allows that? Well, so I was at Source Boston when I first started presenting this little hack right here, and I forgot to blank out the domain that was used, and it got leaked publicly, so this doesn't work anymore. But at one time it did work, and you could do a zone transfer from it, and in about 2.5 seconds you can get 120,000 hosts. If you can find a dynamic DNS provider that has one DNS server anywhere in its chain that's hosting these records that allows a zone transfer, because sometimes someone makes an oops, that means 2.5 seconds, 120,000 potential targets. Sweet. So here's another way to collect. If you want to know, let's say you got this D-Link DIR 655 router at your house, delivered from Newegg, for $89, and you go into its configuration and you look to see which dynamic DNS providers are supported right on the host. A lot of these routers come with, this stuff built right into a menu. So if I find a nice vulnerability on this system, I can go look at these DDNS providers. I can use things like zone transfers. I can do DNS subdomain brute forcing to find potential targets to exploit lots of systems. So, scanning the internet reveals a lot of embedded systems. I was actually surprised as to how many were just exposed to the internet without a password, let you log in, and change the person's DNS providers. Now I don't have to worry about uploading a custom configuration or firmware. I can just go change their DNS settings. They're not going to notice it on their host. All their DNS queries can go to a DNS server that I control, and I can start redirecting things. We saw a big hack like this happen in Mexico, where they were hijacking, so they put custom DNS names in people's routers, DNS servers rather, and used it to redirect a popular bank in Mexico to their own website and collect people's financial information. So I don't know if anyone catches this joke, but this was an ISP in Turkey, and I still told Bob to be nice. If you don't understand that, you can see me after. So the Zixel router, this one was great. So it was completely open on the internet. When I browsed to the router, or Bob did, the password was already there. All you had to do was click login. The password was filled in for you. There was no social engineering or anything involved. You just click login and you're into the router. So like I said before, this can get kind of scary. You can start to see where you could build potential botnet around finding these vulnerabilities, creating custom exploits for them, finding these systems very easily, and uploading maybe new firmware, changing the configuration on the routers. So I purchased a WET 610N, which is a wireless bridge. Ethernet on one side, wireless out the other side, because I was too lazy to run cables in my house. So I said, well, let's go through the configuration. It was kind of an exercise for me to look at the security of a particular device. So it went in and it would not let me keep the default password. I had to change the default password of admin to something other than admin. I said, that's awesome. Like, I don't have to give this presentation anymore. I can go do some other research that interests me. The world is a better place. They've finally started smartening up to fix the default password issue, except when you put a new password in, it says, below your settings to your wireless bridge, Linksys highly recommends that you print your settings or write them down. Awesome. Save these settings on a file on my desktop in clear text. So clearly we've still got a little bit of education to do. However, it's better than leaving the password default. This is still better, despite some of the issues with it. It's still better than having a default password. I love the clear text password on the desktop. Here was my original example of the printer. It's not as interesting as some of my newer ones, but to view this page, you must log into this area. HP JetDirect networking is password only, no username required. Thank you for telling me that I only need to guess the password. I don't need to bother guessing the username. The password in this case happened to be password. And you may say, well, what can you do with a printer, Paul? Well, I've always had this fascination with printers. So Bob set out and scanned the internet again, and this time kept printers in mind and found some interesting stuff. These new multifunction devices, even from different from 5 years ago, can do so much more stuff. And they can print, scan, fax, copy, email, wash my car, write TPS reports, bring me beer, pick up my dry cleaning. And a lot of these can be accessed on the internet without authentication. A lot of these internally don't, by default, require authentication at all. This is almost even worse than a default password. This is by default, there's no authentication at all. Because what do most people think? Oh, it's just a printer. I mean, what harm could you possibly do? Now, I do want to reference the Zscaler research that was researching this at the same time I was. They actually published a Perl script that wrote an excellent, fantastic article about this sort of thing with multifunction devices. I highly recommend everyone go read it. Here's an example of my example. These are the new HP Office Jets. They scan, fax, copy, print, and they've got this really neat whiz-bang feature. If you put a piece of paper on the copier or scanner or printer or whatever you want to call it, you can go to the web server on the device, you can scan the document and save it to an image file on your hard drive. I was like, that is so cool. So I was like, well, what if these were exposed to the internet? What kinds of things do you find? Now, I haven't found anything all that interesting yet, other than a waiver form for a yoga studio, which is kind of uninteresting and very boring to read. The Zscaler post found a little bit more interesting stuff. However, what I think that the more interesting thing is with this vulnerability is if you start to write a script like the Zscaler folks have that not only encompasses all of the HP models, but other models, printers do this as well. And every couple of seconds, you're just grabbing whatever comes across on the printer. And not just over the internet either, but when you're doing your internal pen tests, this is a great way to collect sensitive documents. Because people print sensitive stuff, right? If you don't believe me, we can look at this linear printer, and we can see what documents someone has printed. Now, if you manage to figure this out, please be nice to this person, because I've done my best to obfuscate the details here, but you're all very smart people, and I have a feeling you're going to figure it out, so just please be nice. So here we have the job history from a linear printer. Now, I happen to find this one on the internet. This can be kind of a fun thing to do on any kind of a pen test where you can get access to a printer. Let's look at the information we can get from the job history. So what do we know about the type of information this person is dealing with? Something to do with Israel, right? Likely by the title of this paper, they are a pro-Israel type person. Now, political, regional things aside, this is information we would use potentially in a social engineering attack. So that, in a social engineering attack, is a very useful piece of information. What software does this person have loaded on their system? This is all printed from the same user. This username is the same. What software? PowerPoint, and what else? Publisher, right? Excel, and some kind of PDF reader. That's really good stuff for client-side attack. So what do we know about their version of Microsoft Word, or at least the document they were opening wasn't the same as the document that they were opening was not the latest version. So we know at some point someone's using an older version and someone might be using a newer version, which is good information to have if I'm going to send client-side exploits. What do you think this UPO23 spreadsheet is? That's a person's name that I've blanked out. I was kind of curious about that myself. And also this Israel trip, that tells me someone's trying to take a trip. So now with a little help from Google, and this job history, I was able to paint a very, very, I think, pretty cool picture. So the university website that I gathered this from says that a UPO 23 is an electronic hourly time card for a student mentor. So that's good information to have. I could potentially pretend to be that student, what have you. They accept donations. You can see one of the things here is they printed a document called Donations Received in 8/2/2010. So if I can break into this printer and steal what's happening on it, that might be interesting information to have. But I also know they accept donations. So now potential social engineering is someone who might want to donate. I know what applications they run, when they're taking a trip, their area of study, and a little bit about them, just from looking at the printer job history, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, the other question I had was, well, can I have their USB stick? And it turns out you can. And the Zscaler article references this. If you read through the comments, people start citing examples of, hey, you know, I had this embedded device and it let me do this, and look at how stupid that is. And that's the kind of thing I'm trying to generate with my presentations. So it turns out if you put something in the SD card slot, it automatically gets shared out so that you can access that information over the network. So now, if someone starts putting their USB devices on there, you can access the information on them. And that's a linear example there. So enough about printers. Let's talk about one more embedded system that we found vulnerabilities in, and this one is a Roku device. Now, the Roku device is this, again, little device, plugs into the network, or it has wireless, then plugs into my television. And it lets me do things like Netflix. It lets me do things like Amazon.com and stream media. It's got all kinds of custom applications. What I found was that it was open on port 8080. And after trying to hit it with a web browser and not having very much success, I used the trusty old Netcat. And I got back some information and a little caret symbol. I was like, wow, a prompt. Like, geeks get so excited when we see a prompt and nothing else. It's like a challenge. What can I put into this prompt to make it do something? I was so excited. So I think this is like the model number or serial number. Obviously, those are the Ethernet and Wi-Fi MAC address, and then the caret. And I typed everything you could think of into this prompt. I typed question mark. I typed help. I typed / question mark -- hell. Everything I could think of to figure out what the commands were on this command prompt. Then I finally went to Google and I said, okay, Google, please help me. And it reviewed a forum entry that said, well, all you have to do is press up, down, left, right, select, home, forward, back, or pause. And I'm like, well, what does that do? It controls your Roku player. Now, it didn't ask me for a password before I logged into my Roku. That means that remotely, someone can control my Roku device without authentication. You could very easily write a script to send those commands. And if you knew, I mean, you could send it home, send it to the same place every time, and then perform some action on the Roku player that maybe turns control of your Roku player over to someone else. So I thought that was kind of a neat attack. Again, open port, no authentication. Why is it there? Just a little bit of world domination propaganda for you. This actually came in from a listener who probably wants to remain anonymous. He's a really strong geek. So they hacked into a road sign, and made it say hack naked. This, again, is another embedded systems hack that I think, in my plot to take over the world, could be used for propaganda purposes. So some even more attacks. Of course, the big one, HDMore VxWorks, scanned 3.1 billion IP addresses. And HD is the one that gave me some of the tips of, if your virtual hosting provider that you're using to scan the internet is shutting you down, that's okay. Just make sure you have a shell script that's pulling your data off of it, like every couple of seconds, so you don't lose their data when they shut you down. That happened to me, and AC was like, oh, no, we've been there, it's fine. You just got to back up your data and then move on to another one. So that was some awesome research. The DNS rebinding attack, again, is attacking wireless routers. And to kind of go back to the gentleman's point about the web interface being exposed, not even with this attack does port 80 need to be open, but what happens is the firewall associates the internal IP address and the external IP address together in the IP tables configuration, and the rebinding attack takes advantage of that. There's a document, if you download the code in the docs directory, that explains in complete detail how that attack works. The two researchers that did the Nintendo Wii and DS systems were actually able to distribute malware off of a Nintendo Wii, which I thought was cool. Of course, Barnaby Jack's ATM, even more fodder in our plot to take over the world. One of the thing I want to point out in this Linksys HNAP vulnerability is that I was working with this particular router. I worked a little bit with PSART. It turned out not to be a big deal, except for one thing that I want to put forward and help change in our industry. So I was looking at HNAP, which is a protocol primarily for support reasons. So, you know, Cisco can remote into your PC and then have a standard protocol to talk to your devices and collect information from them for support reasons. I was looking at HNAP on a particular router. I was sending it what I thought was valid requests, and the web server was crashing. I thought, well, that was cool. There could be something here. I'm not quite sure why the router was crashing. My thought is it was upgraded from DD-Word back to the original firmware. There were some NVRAM settings that probably weren't right, and that's why the router was crashing. However, I got talking to Cisco PSART about HNAP and started talking about how it listens on the port 8080. You can hit it with a web browser. You can collect information. I fed some of this feedback back to Tenable Research. There's a Nessus plugin that can collect this information for you. You can write a script to collect the information from the HNAP. It's pretty well documented. It's pretty easy to send commands. I was using curl to send commands over to the router via HNAP. So this one actually was interesting. It ran on the same port as the admin interface, but was in a directory. You had to append HNAP1, and that lets you interface with the XML requests. So those are the requests that I sent to it, if anyone can reproduce the problem. So in talking with the Cisco PSART, I said, well, that's all fine and good. I said, but I still don't feel comfortable because I crashed the web server by sending what I thought was a valid HNAP request. I wasn't even trying to fuzz it. What happens when we try to fuzz it and we find vulnerabilities? He said, well, there's no way to disable HNAP. I said, well, wait a minute. You're telling me that you ship millions of these devices all over the world, and you're putting into a protocol that could have vulnerabilities, let's be honest here, and you're telling me there's no way to disable it in the default firmware. He said, yeah, we're looking into that. So I think that should never happen. I think you should have the ability in the interface in order to disable it. Now, you can disable it if you rip off Linksys's firmware and you put new firmware on it, but you can't do that with every single device. I mean, if you spent enough time, you probably could, but not every device is DD-Word supported and has an easy time of upgrading the firmware. So now I can stand up here and I can talk about exploits and vulnerabilities on embedded systems for, until I'm blue in the face or until you're tired of hearing about it, which was probably 15 minutes ago. But my thing is, what do we do about it? There are some horrible things that are happening out here in terms of security with embedded systems. I've set up a website. I've decided to make registration for this website public. I'll deal with the spammers. Right now you have to email me, and you can email me now. Email me today, paul@paul.com.com. I'll set you up an account. It's a wiki, and what I want you to do is post your security fail. So you go to securityfail.com. It's a wiki. There's already some articles there. I'll show you some examples. And talk about security fail. This doesn't have to be a zero-day exploit. It doesn't even have to be what we would term something as a vulnerability that would be included in CVE. A lot of these are vulnerabilities like this system has a default password. Was that really like a vulnerability that CVE would pay attention to? Not really. And I think that's a lot of the problems that we're dealing with. So I want to document this, and I want to start to raise awareness. So securityfail.com used to redirect to grc.com. So it's now a public wiki, like I said, and here are some of the goals. I said, well, I'm not going to put this website up unless I have at least a few goals in mind. So the first goal here is we want to make manufacturers make a device that will force users to change the default password. Is that so hard? I think for support and cost and money reasons they don't, but really, let's encourage them, force the user to choose the default password. When we were working on the ultimate WRT54G hacking book, we were working closely with the OpenWRT developers, and they said, we let the user choose their initial password, and even if they choose a bad password, it's better than a known password that anyone can Google for and log into the systems. And I thought, wow, that's such a simple thing. It makes so much common sense, but we don't find it commonplace in the industry. We want to allow users to disable all the protocols on the device. I mean, that's like if you go buy a car and it comes with a sunroof and you can't close it. That would suck, right? So we want to only enable secure management protocols. Why don't we have things like HTTPS and SSH on our systems? So those are kind of my top 3 goals. We also want ISPs to do some kind of management of the devices on their network, keep up to date with firmware, do proper filtering, turn off web management interfaces, and maybe block inbound port 80 on some user subnets. I've lived with that since I first got DSL. Port 80 doesn't work incoming for me. So, I mean, if I can live with it, the rest of us can too, right? So, this is a nonprofit project. You know, I don't want to get any money for this. I want to just raise awareness about the issue of embedded systems so that you don't have to hear me constantly talking about it and we can talk about something else. Because I will talk about it until we start to affect some change. And my idea was to create a public wiki and gain community support and kind of push vendors in the right direction. By all means, if you have other ideas, I'm more than happy to hear them. You know, let's talk about them. So these are just some examples. You know, someone wrote in and said, hey, on this Buffalo router, the username that is by default is in the web page, or the password error. If you enter the wrong password, it discloses the username to you. So, you know, like you would never do that on a Windows or a Linux system. Would it come back and say, oh yeah, by the way, the username is root to log into the system? You wouldn't see that on a system, but we see it on embedded systems. How are they any different? We see some configuration leakage here, password leakage on this particular Belkin router is another example that's already on securityfail.com. So as far as my plot for world domination, it turns out there's an app for that, or maybe someone beat me to it, I'm not sure which. So things that I kind of ran out of room to cover. I mean, I got 10 minutes left. I wanted to leave time for questions. The Chuck Norris worm, I kind of touched on it briefly when I said you could create malware. It turns out that I did a little bit of analysis, and I want to get back to researching it more, that the Chuck Norris worm and the PSY bot, the PSY bot was really just a piece of Linux code that was compiled from MIPS and uploaded to run on various devices and did botnet type activity. The Chuck Norris worm that was running around was just a variant of the PSY bot. I actually tracked down the person that did the original analysis of the malware, and I have some copies of it in his full analysis. So I want to understand that more, because I think we're going to see more of that kind of stuff for all the reasons that I mentioned in the presentation. There's a lot of great research going on with static device firmware. There's a blog called icysilence.org. If anyone knows the person who runs that or whatever, like I want to buy him a couple of beers, awesome research going on there. He's reverse engineering firmware and figuring out, oh, hey, look, if you log in with this username and password, it lets you log in with administrative privileges, and that's hard-coded inside the firmware. So there's a lot of people finding bugs like that too, which I think are awesome, and something that's so easily avoidable. Analyzing video game systems like TiVo and Blu-ray players, which I didn't even talk about in the presentation, but your TiVo and your Blu-ray players all have connections to the internet now, and pretty soon I think, and it's already happening, your TV is going to have a connection to the internet. So those are yet even more devices. I did not talk about wireless type worms and default Wi-Fi settings. We saw all those millions of open wireless access points that still exist. A wireless worm is still, I think, a possibility. And the last thing was just, you know, segmentation is really just a Band-Aid. People say, well, we've got all these vulnerable systems and printers and embedded systems. Let's just put them over there for now. And no one will know the vulnerabilities because they're segmented on a separate part of the network. And as we all know, nothing's really truly segmented. It always has either a firewall or some device providing access to it, or someone takes a USB thumb drive and sticks it in and infects something. So I think that segmentation is just taking the problem and putting it somewhere else. Let's solve the problem at the root and get manufacturers to start doing some very basic things to improve security. So with that, are there any questions? Yes. Yeah, the question and comment was, you know, do you think that there would be a usage for a benchmark for embedded systems, similar to I have benchmarks for other things and standards for security? Absolutely. That's exactly where we need to go. You know, we can work with organizations like MITRE in the U.S., produces similar kind of standards like that. I think that's a great idea. I think that's exactly where we need to go. I think I'd like to add on to that. Maybe we need to analyze how the manufacturers are doing things and say, look, here's the standard, and here's where you are, way down there, and kind of do some public shame to get people to change. That's a good point. More questions? Oh, I think there's a question over here.
One of the things coming up is IPv6 and the Internet of Things, where everything will be directly connected on the Internet. And one of the things that has to do with the Internet of Things is that they're actually looking at security, because they thought, well, the box is behind the NAT router with the customer and doesn't connect to the Internet anyway. Do you actually see something like that, where actually the manufacturer are looking at security because of IPv6?
No, I don't see any embedded device manufacturers looking seriously at security or taking into account that, like you said, and I completely agree, IPv6, everything could have a public IP address now and might be even more exposed to the Internet. I think one of the problems that we have with IPv6 now that I think is interesting is the ability to find those devices. So when you look at scanning 20 million or more, or maybe 1 billion potential IP addresses to find like 1,000 embedded systems, that can take a really long time. I think the reason I'm able to scan and find stuff is because our address space isn't that bad right now. When we move to IPv6, it's going to be gigantic. So I think that's why methods like NTP and DNS are going to be critical to finding those embedded systems. So we don't want manufacturers hiding their vulnerabilities just because IPv6 is so big. But that's a good point. Was there a question over here? There's one here. Sorry, we'll get to you if there are questions over there. Or maybe I'm just delusional. It's been known to happen.
I saw some hands.
It's lack of beer is what's happening. What's that? I went home early last night? Oh. What's that? Because of the lack of beer? No. Oh, yeah.
Paul, you mentioned
yes.
You mentioned the example of that router that forces you to change that password.
Yes.
It's very nice that you have this admin interface, but most of these devices are configured to work out of the box. So you plug the cables in, you put the power in, hey, it works, and nobody ever touches the admin interface again. So, yeah, how do we fix that?
Thanks for bursting my bubble. I was all excited that the device let us change the default password.
Sorry.
And no, and you're right. A lot of the devices, they just want people to plug them in. And again, you know, manufacturers are trying to make a cheap device. They're trying to keep their support costs down, so they don't want people to two things. They don't want people calling the help desk, and they don't want people telling their friends, hey, I bought this device, and then posting it online. It was a wicked pain in the ass to set up. That's a U.S. term in Rhode Island, too. It's wicked. It's a word. We'll come see me after. I'll teach you about the word wicked. It's wicked cool. Any more questions? Actually, I ended early. That never happens.
Anyone else has a question? We have time for 2 more. All right.
Not from this guy. Yes, Chris.
I had a quick question. Apparently you wrote a book about embedded devices as well. Did any of the vendors that you covered in the book ever come to you and say, you wrote a book about embedded devices, you covered our device, how can we do this better, or are they just completely uninterested in the stuff you were writing?
No, they completely ignore me. I think they're scared.
It's probably
really. Yeah, I've never been contacted by a vendor about any of the stuff I've talked about, and I mean I've publicly shown their devices being vulnerable in production deployment environments, and they just don't care. I think if anyone works for a vendor and does care, I'm happy to have a beer with you. Yes.
I want to raise a suggestion for the future, programming a streamer so it would transmit subliminal messages. That could be nice if you want to control the world.
In the plot to take over the world, I totally agree there should be subliminal messages. Yes. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Yes, because like starting a cult. See, if I can get Chris to be on my side, world domination in like less than a week. He's like, I'm on board. I've had people go up to the other presentation like, yeah, I'm on board. Let's take over the world. They're like, no, it's just to prove a point. Anyway.
All right. One more question. Anyone?
You can check out the stuff on our podcast. We talk a lot about this stuff on our podcast. I would say I'm going to make the wiki public. I'll announce that on the podcast. I'll put it up on our blog, and I'll announce it on our mailing list as well. So if you're looking to not have me create your account for you, which you can still do if you just have something you want to talk about now. If not, and you want to wait till I open up registration on it, hit our mailing list or listen on our podcast, and I'll announce it.
Right. Paul, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you.